qualifications to comply with the positive duty requirements. There is a lot in this, so this is going to be quite a high-level session around the expectations in terms of compliance, and I'll also give you some information on where you can go if you would like some more detailed information or if you'd like to access some additional training for your managers and leaders. This workshop is proudly brought to you with the support of the Australian Government Department of Employment and Workplace Relations through the Productivity, Education and Training Fund grant program. Quick disclaimer, information is general in nature. We encourage you to seek advice on any specific circumstances. And we're going to kick off looking at what is positive duty. So, well, probably 18 months up to August 2023, there was a change in the requirement for workplaces. Instead of having a stock standard duty of care, a new requirement for a positive duty was introduced. So a positive duty is a legal duty for businesses to take reasonable and proportionate measures to eliminate relevant unlawful conduct as far as possible. So prior to this change, making sure that you had a sexual harassment and discrimination policy was generally what you needed to have in terms of protecting your organisation and meeting your requirements. Now there is an expectation that organisations will do more to prevent any type of unlawful conduct from happening in the first place. There is a lot of research. If you like to read up on these things, there's some really comprehensive information which I will send you a link to. But the research shows that if we take a proactive stance and attempt to prevent sex-based harassment or discrimination in workplaces, it's much more effective than just having a more reactive stance, which is what we've had in the first place. The whole idea of it is to create safe, respectful and inclusive workplaces, and organisations and businesses are required to be proactive and take appropriate measures to eliminate relevant unlawful conduct. So this is quite unique in this positive duty requirement, and I'm not really aware of anything else within workplaces that we are required to do this. So everybody must satisfy this positive duty requirement. It's not limited to big business. There is an expectation that regardless of your business size, you would be doing something to proactively prevent harassment and discrimination in the workplace, which I'll just refer to as unlawful conduct because it's much easier to say. It includes sole traders, self-employed, small, medium and large businesses and government. Doesn't matter whether you're a commercial enterprise or not-for-profit. And ultimately, the person that is responsible is the PCBU or the person conducting business or undertaking. And the definitions are available in the guidelines, which I will send you a link to after this workshop. So the positive duty covers discrimination on grounds of sex or gender in a work context, any type of sexual harassment in connection with work, sex-based harassment in connection with work, any conduct that would amount to subjecting a person to a hostile work environment on the grounds of their sex, and any related acts of victimisation. So if somebody did make a complaint and something happened to them, then it's covered under this positive duty requirement. Interestingly enough, the positive duty not only covers people within your organisation, but third parties towards employees and workers in connection with their work. So this might include clients, customers, suppliers. So, you know, the old mate that comes and drops something off in the morning that makes an inappropriate comment towards one of your staff. We're expected to manage all of those things in the workplace. So it's quite a large expectation, and the larger your organisation is, the more resources they expect you to have dedicated to this. So third parties, as I said, might include, you know, your actual customers or clients. It could be students, it could be residents, service users, suppliers and visitors, members of the public. It recognises this extension to these third parties recognises the important role organisations and businesses play in protecting their workers from unlawful behaviour. So, you know, in the past, unless somebody's conduct was pretty bad, we'd kind of just tolerate certain behaviours from customers or clients. That's no longer acceptable. There are some good resources available, which I will send you some links to. So they're posters that you can display in your workplace for customers or suppliers, which kind of outlines the expectations in terms of their conduct. And it recognises that third parties can pose a significant risk to workers. And it really depends on the type of industry that you're working in. If your team are exposed to the general public or a lot of external people, then you would naturally assume the risk would increase. You think about somewhere like an aged care facility, and we're protecting our the residents, but also making sure that the people that are looking after those residents can work in a workplace that's free from any type of unlawful behaviour. According to a 2019 national survey, more than a third of sexual harassment incidents in the fast food and retail industries were perpetrated by a customer. 21% of the union employees that they surveyed had been sexually harassed by a customer in their current job, with that figure far higher for women and younger workers. So we can kind of see that there is a need for this, depending on what generation you're from and your work history. You may be able to relate to some of these statistics, or you might have witnessed those sorts of things occurring. So as I said, this obligation to have a proactive stance on preventing unlawful behaviour applies to all organisations, and they use the terminology reasonable and proportionate. We love this word reasonable. So they'll take into account the size, nature and circumstances of the business they're undertaking, what sort of resources that business might have access to, financial or otherwise, the practicability and the cost measures that would be required to eliminate unlawful conduct, and any other relevant matters. So the plain English version of this is the more resources that your business has, human and financial, the more the expectation is that there would be some activities occurring that are really demonstrating a commitment to eliminating unlawful conduct. There is a bit of a guide in the guidelines for complying with the positive duty, which I will send you. So positive duty and vicarious liability. So employers and their principals can be held liable for conduct committed by their employees or agents. So, if you're the PCBU or the employer, you are considered to be vicariously liable for the conduct of your team. So if an employee sexually harasses a co-worker, an employer may be legally responsible for the actions of that employee. And that will really come down to the amount of education and training that has been provided, as well as what's acceptable within that workplace culture. So an employer has to be able to demonstrate that they took all reasonable steps to prevent that unlawful conduct from occurring. Not just, I'm not their parent, it's not my problem if they're doing the wrong thing, that's on them. And that will be determined by a court, not by the commission. So it kind of creates even more of a business case to be doing something about this. I don't think anybody manages an organisation or runs a business and accepts sexual harassment or discrimination in the workplace, but it's really about understanding that some of this kind of behaviour, it starts small, and if it's left unchecked, we're effectively authorising that behaviour. So if somebody makes an inappropriate comment in the workplace, a manager or a leader hears that and doesn't say something about it, what we're effectively doing is condoning it. And so that can lead to an escalation of behaviours, from something very small through to something quite serious if we're not dealing with it, which is why workplace culture and leadership is such an important part of preventing workplace harassment and discrimination. So the Commission, so the Australian Human Rights Commission, have the power to conduct inquiries into compliance with the positive duty and provide recommendations to businesses to achieve compliance. I'm going to give you some high-level information around the sorts of evidence that they would be looking for in terms of compliance. They can also issue a compliance notice or apply to the federal courts for an order to direct compliance if a business is not willing to comply, as well as enter into enforceable undertakings. An inquiry can be commenced without the consent of an organisation or business, and investigative powers will require employers to provide information and documents, as well as to examine witnesses where there's a case to do so. And in an ideal world, the Commission will want to work with an organisation in a voluntary basis to support them to meet their obligations. So it's like anything compliance-based. If we're doing something and people can see that we're trying to do the right thing, there's very much that sort of, carrot approach before there's any type of, stick put into play. So the guiding principles of the positive duty requirement include consultation. So this is a workplace health and safety issue. Sexual harassment is defined as a psychosocial hazard under our workplace health and safety requirements. So consulting with staff, trying to establish gender equality in a meaningful way. So that's not just, it's not things like having targets and, we have to have an X number of, women in these roles. But it's more about eliminating the things that might lead to gender inequality within workplaces. Intersectionality, it took me a while to get my head around this one, but I've got a slide coming up that will help explain what that means. And person-centred and trauma-informed. So there's a lot of training around trauma-informed kind of policies and procedures in this space, but it's really just recognising that some people are going to feel quite uncomfortable going through certain processes or raising issues in certain forums, and making sure that we're very considerate about how we encourage people to report issues and how we deal with those issues once they've been reported, so as not to re-traumatise the individual or individuals involved. So intersectionality, I will give a shout out to Sexual Assault Support Services Tasmania, which they did a webinar for us only a couple of months ago for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So we'll also give you a link to that recording when we send out the resources from this session. But this was quite powerful for me, and I think it's really useful if you're talking to your team about eliminating, inappropriate behaviours in the workplace. It extends beyond sexual harassment. It's things like bullying, things that affect people's experience in the workplace. So hopefully you can see this wheel or key, but basically what it's saying is the more attributes you have towards the centre of this circle, the more power you have to do something about behaviours and attitudes within workplaces that don't align with lawful conduct. And so if you're an Australian citizen with a tertiary education, English is your first language, you've got robust mental health, you're a man with white-coloured skin, no disability, heterosexual, owns your own property and has some generational wealth, you are the most powerful person and the person in the most with the most ability to stand up and to change behaviours or to call things out when you observe them. I found this quite powerful because I never thought I'd need somebody to stick up for me. And then when I saw this, I was like, this is why, because I tick so many of the boxes close to the middle of that wheel of power. And the further out that people get, the less power they have to be able to either report inappropriate behaviours or call inappropriate behaviours out in the workplace. So I've used this a couple of times when delivering some sessions in workplaces and really called upon people that have a lot of those attributes close to the centre of that wheel of power to take a leadership role regardless of what their position in the organisation is. And this is this intersectionality piece. So if you've got multiple aspects of this wheel of power that are around the outside of the wheel of power, then that's the intersectionality of a whole raft of attributes that make you more or less likely to be able to call out inappropriate behaviour or stand up for what you think should be happening. So we'll send you a copy of these slides as well. And I'll also send you a link because Sexual Assault Support Services Tasmania offer positive duty training for leaders in workplaces. And I think, this is a great way to make sure that you're meeting your positive duty requirements, but by paying for training with an organisation like this, you're also supporting a really valuable Tasmanian not-for-profit service provider doing very important work in our community. So I'll send you a link to that training as well. Okay, so I might just pause for a second and see if there are any questions before we launch into the 7 standards. Nothing in the chat. Any questions before I jump into the 7 standards and evidence requirements for those? All right, feel free to sing out if you would like to or drop a question in the chat. All right, So the positive duty guidelines utilise 7 standards in order to meet our requirements. So again, please take this in context of your business size. If you've got not very many employees, then this is probably going to happen more informally, but I would recommend documenting anything you do. The larger your organisation, the greater the expectation of having written records and more formal processes to meet your requirements under these standards. So the first one is leadership, obviously, because, things happen from the top down more often than not. The first one is that senior leaders, and this would include if you are governed by a board, I would strongly advise starting with your board and then working your way through your organisation, need to have an awareness and an understanding of their obligations under the Sex Discrimination Act, and in particular relation to the 7 standards for our positive duty requirements. They're responsible for making sure that there are appropriate measures in place to prevent and respond to unlawful conduct. So that might include the development of resources, the reporting of those resources, how we communicate them and how we implement them. And there's a requirement to regularly review the effectiveness of those measures and update workers. So I'd probably be using some consultation around the effectiveness of those measures, as well as whether or not you've actually had anybody access any of the your policies or procedures or other activities under your positive duty requirements. If you've done some training around positive duty, probably measure the effectiveness of that training. Do people walk out of it feeling more informed? Are they more aware of what is considered to be acceptable and unacceptable behaviour in a workplace? Leadership also need to have a visible commitment to safe, respectful and inclusive workplaces. And that includes role modelling respectful behaviour. So in the guidelines, there's actually some very useful hints and tips around sorts of things that you can be doing in order to address the leadership component. I could have gone on for days with this, so I've really just pulled out the sort of examples that they'd be looking for in terms of evidence requirements that you're doing something under that leadership principle. And that's things like documented proposed measures to eliminate unlawful conduct by reference to each of the standards and progress towards implementing those measures. So you might have a plan. So if you haven't already got one after today, you might pull out these 7 standards and you might actually put some actions down next to each of those. Something that we could definitely help with, but also something you might be able to do as part of a leadership workshop on positive duty. For example, it talks about a written prevention and response plan. So correspondence and evidence that you've consulted with your workers and their representatives. So if you've got unions involved, so you might want some meeting agendas and meeting minutes to demonstrate that. Feedback from workers, results of surveys and exit interviews, and any actions that you might have taken to address issues raised. Making sure that you've got policies, codes of conduct, senior leaders, contracts and position descriptions. So you might include something in there around them role modelling appropriate behaviours, a focus of their role being to proactively prevent or eliminate unlawful behaviours in the workplace. Induction manuals, if you do not have a sexual harassment and a bullying policy in your induction manual that you get people to sign off on, I would strongly recommend that would be an excellent starting point for you. Organisational values, so things like respect and inclusivity or diversity, those sorts of things. Notice boards and the intranet, so how do you promote this stuff out to your broader workforce and also potentially to your customers? Board papers and minutes. I would suggest that positive duty as a standing agenda item on a board paper would be a very nice piece of evidence to have, particularly in conjunction with a written prevention and response plan and your progress towards achieving some of the things in that plan. Statements made about relevant unlawful conduct within the workplace or externally. So there's kind of an expectation that if you have, a full staff meeting, or if you've got a CEO or a leader of your organisation, that they would be regularly encouraging people to role model and behave in accordance with your policies and procedures, and encouraging people to call out behaviours that are not consistent with those. Signage, so I'll see whether I can pull that up. I'll send you a link to this page. Hopefully you can see the fact sheets there. But there's posters for, sexual harassment and sexist behaviour won't be tolerated. The law has changed. Then there's some internal posters as well. So having something along those lines displayed around your workplace is also an excellent way to meet your obligations. Copies of the guidelines or any other relevant resources signed off by senior leaders to confirm that they've been read and understood. Records of attendance at committees, groups and events focused on inclusion and memberships of relevant external organisations. So a membership of the TCCI would be a good plan because we will often provide regular updates and we can support you to put in place measures to help meet your positive duty requirements, or potentially your peak body if you've got a HR department, being a member of the Australian Human Resources Institute. All of those sorts of things demonstrate that you're trying to be aware of your obligations and meet your requirements. And obviously, if you are running training sessions, attendance records for training sessions, as well as the content of those training sessions. So there's a few things, and you'll see there's some duplication as we go through each of these standards in terms of the evidence requirements and some of the things that you can be doing that help meet your positive duty requirements. So the second of those standards is culture, and the requirement is really to foster a culture that's safe, respectful and inclusive, that values that diversity and gender equality. It empowers workers to report relevant unlawful conduct and minimises harm, as well as holding people accountable for their actions. So some of the examples that we'd like to see for that second standard are correspondence with workers and meeting notes, feedback from workers, exit interviews, results of surveys of workers and associated actions. So if you're running regular staff engagement surveys or something along those lines, you could potentially look at putting some questions in. Most of those surveys are anonymous, so you could be asking whether or not you feel like this workplace is a workplace that, I don't know, respects gender diversity, that it's a workplace that's free from harassment or inappropriate behaviour. And then if you're not getting the answers that you're expecting, it can give you some insight into some things that you might want to do to try and address those issues. Again, those posters, notices and brochures. So there is a requirement to kind of provide information around the different support services that are available. If you have an employee assistance program, that is a big tick. We've nearly reached the point now where there is an expectation that an employer would have an employee assistance program. It used to be that nice to have, and we're an employer of choice because we have one. Now it's something that in terms of the positive duty and the psychosocial hazard requirements, we're kind of saying to employers, you should really have an EAP. It's not kind of a nice thing now, it's an essential thing. What do your induction manuals have in them? So what sort of culture are we kind of creating through our inductions? What are our values, code of conduct? Again, the contracts and job descriptions talking about appropriate behaviour in the workplace. And then in terms of that equality and discrimination component, what do the incentive plans, bonus structures and those sorts of things look like? And are there things that are inherently discriminatory built into those? And you might not be able to see it if you've been working with them for some time, so it's not a bad idea to have a bit of consultation with your workforce. And then you might keep some notes from the consultations, evidence that you've been meeting your requirements. You might keep data on gender equality, workplace diversity and associated actions, if that's something that's on your radar. If you have gender equality or diversity or inclusion strategies, targets and associated performance metrics. And then any special measures that you might put in place to help foster and maintain an inclusive and supportive workplace culture. All right, the third of these standards is knowledge. So there's an expectation that there would be, policy requirements around respectful behaviour and unlawful conduct. It's, the most baseline and formal of those, that knowledge building within organisations. That organisations and businesses support workers, including leaders and managers, to engage in safe, respectful and inclusive behaviour. And that might be having a toolbox meeting or a training session on expected standards of behaviour. It might be around identifying behaviours that could constitute unlawful conduct and being very clear about the consequences for that. And making sure that everybody's aware of their rights and responsibilities in relation to safe, respectful and inclusive workplaces and working relationships. And that includes their role in terms of preventing and responding to relevant unlawful conduct. So one of the things we emphasise when we deliver workshops on this is about, if you see something, say something. So if you see something that you think is inappropriate, go and check in with the person that might have been on the receiving end of it. And if they don't feel comfortable with it, encourage them to say something, to report it or to raise it with the person concerned. It doesn't necessarily have to be a HR report. If it's something that's making people feel uncomfortable in the workplace, it could also go through your workplace health and safety system. So it might be reported as a hazard or a workplace incident, depending on the severity of it. So and that should be clear to people within your workplace. What are my reporting requirements? You know, if I have experienced something or if I've seen something, part of this knowledge standard is that people have the knowledge about what is and isn't acceptable and what to do if they've identified something within the workplace, either as a victim or if they've observed something. So we'd want some attendance records for training sessions or modules together with the content. Written policies and procedures such as appropriate workplace behaviour or respectful workplace behaviour policy. We've actually been doing a lot of this respectful workplace behaviour training. I think we call it positive workplace practices because it sounds a bit nicer than respectful workplace behaviour. You know, don't assume that people know what's acceptable and what's not. If you've been in the workforce for a few years, I know the things that were acceptable when I first started working nearly 30 years ago, if they happened today, would be entirely unacceptable. And there's some people in our workplaces that really struggle with this. I do a lot of work with people that have been in their job for 30 or 40 years, and when you start talking about this kind of stuff, they get quite defensive and upset. But what we really need to do is to try and shift some of those attitudes, or at the very least, put some parameters in place around those types of behaviours. So if you want to make reference to somebody's appearance, that's great. Don't do it at work and don't do it with any of our customers or clients. When you're at home in your own personal time, knock yourself out. What else do we want to have? Notes and agendas from meetings with workers. So I would be having at least monthly toolbox talks on some element of appropriate workplace behaviour, the code of conduct or your reporting processes, you know, how to use our workplace health and safety system to report inappropriate workplace behaviour. Position descriptions, work plans, performance development frameworks with mandatory learning requirements. Again, I would suggest that a toolbox meeting and a policy and sign off from your leaders within your organisation would be a bare minimum. And if you are a larger organisation, you probably need to be looking at doing a little bit more and demonstrating you've thrown a bit at this. If you're a smaller organisation, then you're probably getting close to starting to meet some of those requirements, particularly with some workplace signage and regular updates. Those education materials that are being made available to workers, leaders and managers in relation to sexual harassment and sex-based discrimination in the workplace. You might get feedback from workers on engagement survey data to demonstrate the level of understanding of what constitutes lawful and unlawful conduct, as well as attitudes towards that sort of conduct. So again, you're starting to see some common things coming through here. Risk management. So organisations and businesses recognise that relevant unlawful conduct is an equality risk and a health and safety risk. They take a risk-based approach to prevention and response. So again, we'd be looking to see some correspondence with workers or meeting agendas. If you've got a WHS committee, you could potentially consult with them about some of this stuff. A completed risk framework and or a risk register or other evidence of how you've identified risks, as well as what sort of control measures you might have implemented. So, for example, you might recognise that your customers pose a risk to your workers, and so you might get some of the signage that's available from the Human Rights Commission website and display that signage in the workplace, as well as provide your staff members with a bit of training around what to do if somebody is making inappropriate comments in the workplace or making them feel uncomfortable. Do they report it to a supervisor? What sort of things can they or can't they say to the customer? But making sure that they know they don't have to put up with it, particularly younger workers. They are generally the more vulnerable in our workplaces because they're not sure what is and isn't acceptable. You might analyse some data that's related to the unlawful conduct, including, you know, reporting figures on and gender equality indicators, if that's something you're measuring. Again, board papers. If I was a director of a board, I would want my organisation to have this well and truly on the radar, as well as documented the controls and the effectiveness of each of the controls for the risks that you've identified. Making sure that we've got support, that's number 6 in the standards. So ensuring appropriate support's available to workers, leaders and managers that might witness or experience relevant unlawful conduct, EAP, as well as sexual assault support services, Tasmania. There's a range of different organisations that would be able to provide support services, and that we make those available to employees or workers so that they can access the support regardless of whether or not they report the conduct. So written materials, posters, brochures, information sheets or emails. So, even a monthly email out to our workforce to go, just letting you know that we've got the employee assistance program, or here are some various support services available if you feel the need to access them. Don't wait until there's one person that you think might need it, send it out to everybody. Just have it as a regular thing. And then people won't be going, oh my goodness, who needs that? Why are we all getting that email? Again, attendance records for training sessions that include support options, associated training content and evaluation of the training. So if you're going to run some training, make sure that you actually do an evaluation to see whether or not it's been effective. I can't tell you how many ineffective training sessions I've sat through in my life, but I will tell you that the SAS online session that we did was a really good session, and it was delivered very well. So, hopefully if you use an organisation that has a good reputation for delivering quality training, then the evaluation and the impact of that training will be worth the investment that your organisation makes. The evidence of any supports offered, such as emails to workers or notes of conversations, including in your staff surveys, questions about did you know that we have these support services available? And you might have some information about your employee assistance program and the number of times it's been accessed by workers, which is probably all you're going to get because the rest of that service is confidential. All right, we're nearly there. Number 6, reporting and response. So ensuring there are options for reporting and responding to relevant unlawful conduct, and that those options are regularly communicated to our workers or anyone else that might be impacted within our organisation. That might include volunteers. Sorry, I forgot about volunteers. Volunteers, all the same rights as workers effectively, except they don't get paid and they're not covered by the Fair Work Act. But we still have a positive duty to keep volunteers safe in our workplace, and also make sure that our volunteers are aware of our expectations in terms of what is considered to be lawful and unlawful behaviour. We want to have some evidence of responses to reports of relevant unlawful conduct, and making sure that those responses are excuse me, consistent and timely. That the response to any reporting is designed to minimise harm and victimisation of anybody involved, and that any consequences for unlawful behaviour in the workplace are consistent and proportionate. So depending on the severity of any type of sexual harassment in the workplace, it could be anything from a written warning and some training all the way through to summary dismissal, depending on the nature of that particular behaviour. So again, we'd like to see posters or brochures setting out reporting options. Your notice boards are going to be very full. Can I suggest that if you do have notice boards or regular communications, that you rotate the content around? If we just leave the same thing stuck up or email out exactly the same thing, people won't read it anymore. Whereas if we can rotate through a bit of a library of posters or brochures or information sheets, then hopefully people are much more likely to engage with it because it looks a bit different. You absolutely 150% need a written procedure or policy for reporting relevant unlawful conduct, and you need to make sure that there are multiple people in your organisation that conduct can be reported to. If there's only one, that can be somewhat problematic, because if I don't feel comfortable reporting it to that person, then how do I actually tell anybody about it? You would need to have some evidence of the outcomes of reviews of your processes and systems for reporting and responding to incidents. So, if you did have an incident, you used your system, did it work, didn't it work? Did you identify anything that you could do to make it better? Outcomes of consultation with workers or surveys. Again, employee engagement surveys are a really good tool here to consult with workers. And then what sort of data have you got in terms of reports, including the responses taken and the outcomes, obviously kept highly confidential and securely stored. And the last of the standards is the monitoring, evaluation and transparency. So that we're collecting appropriate data to understand the nature and the extent of any relevant unlawful conduct concerning their workforce. Using that data to assess and improve the culture, as well as developing measures to prevent and respond to any unlawful conduct. And that we're quite transparent about the nature and extent of reported behaviours. Obviously, we're not naming names. But we could certainly make it clear that, you know, we've had some incidences or there's been an incident, we're dealing with it, you know, and we don't tolerate this type of behaviour. So we obviously need to respect the privacy of those concerned, but to a certain degree, we need to be quite transparent about that reporting process. And if we are continuously improving it, making changes to it, that we're communicating those changes to our workforce. So notes on any type of evaluation or reflection. This is probably something that would be done at a board or a senior management level. Meeting notes of consultation that's been conducted with workers, any survey results, feedback or exit interviews, feedback from third parties potentially, assessment of like where you've actually assessed reports of any relevant unlawful conduct, business data and metrics associated with any of that analysis, reporting registers, and potentially that revised prevention and response plan. If you've had a look at that after 12 months and gone, oh, we've learned some stuff this year, we could make some changes to that plan. But yeah, that's kind of a nice one-stop shop, having a bit of prevention and response plan based on these 7 standards, and what else your organisation could be doing to prevent and eliminate unlawful conduct in your workplaces. So a couple of next steps, I'll send this through to you, but reviewing the guidelines, if you haven't already, there's actually some really useful information in those guidelines. Consider accessing formal training, particularly for your leaders and managers, to make sure that they're role modelling the appropriate behaviours. And as I said, we'd recommend SAS. They have extreme expertise in this space, and they deliver a really nice program around this. If you haven't already, consult with your workers to understand the risks and make sure that you document that consultation. You could even do an anonymous survey or something like that. You know, if people have a fear of, you know, dobbing somebody in, or they're afraid if they tell on somebody or report something that something bad's going to happen to them. So you really need to make it accessible for people to make you aware if there is any of this kind of stuff happening in the workplace. Review, develop, update relevant policies. So your code of conduct, your sexual harassment policy, what your procedures look like for reporting any instances of that, and ensure that you've got information available to your workforce on appropriate behaviour, reporting and support services in relation to sexual harassment and sex-based discrimination. So you can get some help from us. Probably not so much their work ombudsman for this one, but definitely from the Australian Human Rights Commission. And if you have 20 or less full-time equivalent employees, we can help you for free under the Employer of Choice Assist program. So that was a lot of information. I was going to go back to those posters. So you could absolutely take one of these and brand it with your branding if you wanted to. There's the Respect at Work information service, very useful. So if you haven't got anything up in this space, then there's some really useful resources available on the website, as well as guidelines for employers. So this is the guideline that I'll send you, which I would strongly advise you to get sign off from your board and senior management that they have read and understood it. And I would also strongly recommend that if you haven't already done so, I would be providing a copy of your reviewed and updated sexual harassment policy, including the process for reporting any instances through to all of your employees and getting a sign off on that. And then after that, you might think about surveying or engaging with your staff to see what the awareness levels are around what's acceptable and unacceptable behaviour in the workplace, what the general attitudes are, which will kind of determine whether or not you might need to undertake some workplace training or work with some people if they don't seem to engage or understand what those expectations are. All right, so let's stop the recording to see if you have any questions.